Hello, this is Ralph Brandt from the Fireside. I'm going to read Chapter 2 from a book, Christy, Injured in Space. The name of the chapter is Things Are Not Well. The liftoff had just occurred. They had passed the point of max Q, and there was a bump. The flight engineer was immediately on the headset with the calm message, "Kennedy, we have an event." Now into the chapter, Things Are Not Well. Roger, an event, Enterprise. We see cabin pressure falling slightly. Roger, Kennedy, we see the same. We also see the O2 pressure on the primary ECS supply falling. Roger, Enterprise. Kennedy, we have closed the main ECS O2 supply and the cabin port. Individual suit supply set to secondary ECS. Secondary ECS moved from standby to on, individual suit pressurized. Cindy Garrett was the flight engineer and the junior member of the flight crew. This was her fourth flight, and she was good. She had already made several decisions and acted to protect her crew and the vehicle. The primary environmental control system, or ECS, was leaking out of both ends, the high-pressure O2 and the cabin pressure. She closed the ECS valve to the high-pressure O2 supply. This should stop the loss of O2. Then she closed the cabin vent to the main ECS to prevent cabin pressure loss, and turned the secondary ECS to pressurize the lines to their suits rather than the cabin. Christy could feel the gloves of her suit stiffen. Her suit was being pressurized, and the pressure outside it in the cabin was falling. Cindy was back on the radio. "Kennedy, we are still showing cabin pressure loss and O2 pressure loss on the main ECS supply." Her voice sounded calm, but it was up at least an octave. "Roger, Enterprise. We confirm falling cabin pressure and primary ECS O2 loss continuing." Christy knew the meaning. The cryogenic O2 at high pressure was leaking out of the tank. The damage was either between the tank and the valve, or the valve was not closing. If this were true, the tank would bleed dry in a few minutes. Nearly one-third of their critical O2 for the shuttle would soon be gone. In addition, they were now dependent on a backup system and the EECS, the Emergency Environmental Control System. Meanwhile, the port that fed the cabin was leaking air out of the cabin. Either there was cabin damage or the valve was not closing to the ECS unit, the most likely scenario. Something had damaged the lines or the ECS and the wiring that allowed them to close the valves. "Kennedy, we have indicator that the valves have not closed." "Roger, Kennedy. We confirm your readings." "Kennedy, secondary ECS pressure is nominal on the individual suit ECS lines. It appears we cannot pressurize the cabin. I do not wish to waste secondary ECS supplies in an attempt to do that, which most likely will fail. I think the cabin does not have pressure integrity." That last sentence simply meant the cabin was somehow leaking. There was a hole somewhere. Cindy had wisely decided to not waste the secondary oxygen trying to pressurize a cabin that was leaking. "Roger, Enterprise. We concur for now. Stand by. We are working on a possible solution." "Thank you, Kennedy. We appreciate your efforts. Without a long EVA, there is no manual access to those valves." "That is correct, Enterprise." It was good to know that the flight engineer was on the problem. With the circuit going quiet, the commander, Jack Keener, come on. He had made it a point to keep quiet up till now. His flight engineer had a problem. She was using the radio. She was working on the problem, and she seemed to have it in hand. With nothing to report, he was silent. Jen Walters, the pilot, had looked over at him several times. He motioned to be quiet. She nodded assent. Cindy was handling the problem. With Cindy waiting for instructions from the ground, he could break in. "Okay, everyone, keep the suits closed. We have a problem, but we seem to be flying. Everything is A-OK up here. Cindy, you're doing fine. Keep the SECS running and look for anything else to break. I think flight-wise we are fine since we have no alarms up here. As soon as we get to orbit, we will see if we can fix this thing." Jen Walters said nothing. She was looking at instruments and watching for other problems. As yet, she had seen none. By now they were nearing orbit. The failure of a critical major system like ECS was near the parameters for scrubbing the mission, but they could not return to Earth until the cargo bay was emptied. That must be done before they could return. Bringing a shuttle from the ground at rest to orbit, or from orbit to the ground at rest, was very simply a matter of energy transformation. The ascent involved using rockets to add kinetic energy, speed, and potential energy, altitude. Both are measured in foot-pounds in the English system. The moving shuttle had kinetic energy calculated as MV, mass times velocity. In addition, the altitude of the shuttle represented a potential energy based on its mass and altitude, pounds times feet from the ground. Energy could not be destroyed except in nuclear physics, and there it is normally created by destroying matter. Energy of one type, potential and kinetic, can be converted to other forms of energy, for example, heat. A car going downhill can be stopped by pressing the brakes. The kinetic energy, speed, and the potential energy, height, are converted into heat. With the shuttle, it was the same, but the speed and altitude were many magnitudes higher. 15,000 miles an hour rather than 50, and 200 miles up, roughly 1,000,000 feet rather than a few hundred feet. Even with the smaller amount, the brakes on a car had significant heat generated. Hence, to get the shuttle down, the kinetic and potential mechanical energy of the shuttle had to go somewhere, and in this case, other than the small amount that was burned off by using a thruster to slow the shuttle to cause it to re-enter the atmosphere, it was translated into heat by air friction. Combined kinetic and potential energy of the orbiting shuttle was more than enough to heat the shuttle to several thousand degrees and destroy it. But for the ceramic tiles on its belly and the carbon fibers on the leading edges of the wings, it would burn up. With the extra mass of the module in the cargo bay, the sum of the kinetic and potential energies of it and the shuttle were much greater. Translated into heat, it was possibly enough to burn through the tiles. They could not safely land without leaving the module in orbit, even if they just jettisoned it. As the shuttle began its first revolution, the design engineers, project managers, ground and flight crews began the task of salvaging the mission. The seriousness of the damage to the ECS was evaluated in minutes. There was no valve to close to cut off the leakage. It could not be used. By now, the primary ECS O2 supply was depleted. The engineers theorized that some portion of the atmosphere handler had blown out and damaged the electrical system. This would account for the bump they heard. Since the other systems were operating, the damage was confined to the ECS. A small explosion was most likely contained in the unit, but it damaged the electrical controls that shut the valves. The secondary ECS could support the mission, but if it failed, the shuttle would be dependent on the EECS. This elementary emergency system was not as sophisticated and could support the shuttle for only 4 or 5 revs. If the secondary ECS failed, they must be ready to return in the next 6 to 7 hours. If it and the EECS failed, the crew would not survive. The engineers and designers agreed. If everything went well, they had enough time to rendezvous with the station, get the payload out of the bay, secure it, and return. They would not have time to use the arm to put it in place. That would have to be done later. If they could not secure it, they must just dump it and leave. Doing this with a $100 million module was nearly unthinkable. In addition to its loss, this would now be a heavy piece of space junk that would be a hazard to others in space. Alternatives would be rescue it with a later flight or push it into a re-entry and burn-up orbit. Before that option was considered, some portions of it would have to be removed as they might survive re-entry and threaten safety on the ground or be a security issue. But the alternative, the loss of the shuttle and its crew, was even more unthinkable. By the time they were halfway through the first revolution, Christy and Don Engel were in the airlock, donning their heavier EVA suits. This was the only part of the shuttle that could be pressurized independently by the SECS. The use of the O2 supplies to do this was a necessary risk. They were reluctant to put the additional strain on the SECS to use the airlock, but there was no choice. Even if they were jettisoning the module, Don and Christy were needed to help get it out of the bay. The flight crew was meanwhile getting them in position with the station. The ground gave them an aggressive pattern to fly to the rendezvous. The normal rendezvous would have been 4 revs, much slower but expending much less maneuvering fuel. Now there was no reason to conserve the fuel, and there was a reason to make the rendezvous as soon as possible. And with the ECS damage, they could not stay in orbit long enough to need the fuel, and the sooner they were returning, the better. There were too many unknowns. To catch an object in orbit, you slow down, move to a lower and shorter orbit, then when slightly ahead of it, you speed up and move up to its level. Slowing down costs fuel. Speeding up costs fuel. The more you slow or speed up, the more fuel it takes. But the more you slow and speed up, the less time it takes to make a rendezvous. With the shuttle damaged and unable to pressurize, they decided to not expend the time to dock. With the shuttle not pressurized and damaged, it raised risks. With the tie-off at the station, the shuttle cargo bay door was opened and the cargo pulled out of the bay. With the help of the arm, Christy and Don moved the module to a stowage position and secured it. The consumables in the shuttle bay were also quickly stowed. Most of this was fresh food and consumables for the station, which were quickly lashed to the frame of the station. The station crew would have to bring them in later. With the weight of the module, the resupply was minimum. It was limited to only what was critically short at the time. While they were doing this, 2 of the station inhabitants who were returning to the Earth made an EVA with a camera to check the underside of the shuttle. When they learned the shuttle would not be docking, they suited up to transfer from the station airlock to the shuttle. Pilots rotated the shuttle so it could be viewed by the people on the space station. The critical heat-resistant tiles were intact. They could not see any external damage. Whatever happened was internal. The 2 people from the station finished their EVA, entered the shuttle airlock, and prepared to return to Earth. They would fly home in the EVA suit. Christy and Don entered the station as soon as the stowage was complete. Less than a quarter of an hour later, the shuttle was breaking out of orbit. When Jack, Jen, and Cindy touched down in Florida, they had set a second record. The flight of 2 orbits and just over 51 minutes, over 3 hours, was the shortest orbital flight of the U.S. program. The first orbiting mission of Project Mercury, carrying John Glenn, made 3 revs, just over 4.5 hours, the previous record. The remaining crew of the station welcomed Don and Christy. They opened their personal packs that contained a few items they had selected to bring along for their counterparts. It was like the gifts a visiting couple would bring to their hosts. They then settled down to learn about life on the station. Without the shuttle arm, the assembly of the station was on hold. The next shuttle was not due for over 3 weeks. Some main engine problems threatened an even longer delay. They discussed the situation. Kennedy may be able to advance that launch as much as 3 days if they could fix the engines. They would have a couple of weeks to kill. They were discussing the situation when Kennedy called. "Polaris, this is Kennedy." Kim Sanders went to the radio. As senior member of the remaining crew, she was in command. "Kennedy, Polaris here. Kim, we have some engineers here that want to interrupt your peace and quiet. They are doing some figuring. You know how engineers are. Always trying to make work for someone. If we wait till the next shuttle comes up, that is 3 weeks. Even if we push and get lucky, it will be more than 2. It will be bringing up a module almost as heavy as the one you have, and there isn't going to be enough consumables on board to stay long enough to safely do the installation for both missions. We even have the crew down to 3, and we can only put you 1,000 pounds of supplies on it. You will only be getting critical stuff again. That puts us more than 3 weeks behind on the build." Christy looked over at Don. These 2 knew how critical getting this module in place was. The 3-week delay was bad. A further delay was even worse. "We were just talking about that. And we aren't interested in sitting here for 3 weeks breathing oxygen and doing nothing. We were looking for something we could do other than play solitaire on the computers. We have been looking at that module. You have it about 20 feet from being in position. If you can move it that far and turn it about 45 degrees, it will be where it belongs. You fasten it, turn it up, and you can complete your mission before the next fly up. We may have to delay the next shuttle a couple of days at worst, but when it gets there, you are ready for the next piece of the puzzle. Sounds good. We're sending up steps on the printer. We're going to give you the evening to look over it. Get the gear together, and if we're clear on it, we can start tomorrow. If not, we will hold for a day. An hour later, the printer was spitting out paper. This is the end of the second chapter of Christy. This is Ralph Brandt from the Fireside.